9:40 on a Tuesday morning, a cataract clinic waiting room, and the receptionist slides one sheet across the counter before anyone in scrubs has said your name. A form, CMS R131. Nobody reads it. Buried in the print is the line that says, Medicare won't be paying for whatever gets added to your eye today. Cataract surgery itself is one of the better operations medicine has. The part where they take out the clouded lens and put in a plain one is safe, fast, and covered in full. The form shows up because of what's offered alongside it, a lens that also corrects your close-up vision or your astigmatism, priced separately, usually somewhere between $1,500 and $4,000 an eye, depending on the clinic. Medicare's own coverage rules treat that upgrade as outside the basic benefit, which is the government's way of saying this part is optional and you're paying for it. Here's what the upgrade does inside your eye. A standard lens sends light to one focus point. The upgraded lens splits that same light between a near focus and a far one, so you can read a menu without glasses and also see across the room. Splitting light means less of it reaches the back of your eye for any single distance, and less light at the back of the eye means worse contrast. The difference between a gray car and a gray sky at dusk or a curb. The same color as the sidewalk. At night, the light that doesn't land where it should scatters into rings and starbursts around headlights and street lamps. Think of your own drive home some winter evening. Oncoming headlights already too bright, and now put a permanent ring around that glare. Most eyes adjust to it within weeks. That's the ordinary outcome, and it's the honest half of this story. Because a channel that only tells you the failure version is lying by omission. The harder story belongs to the minority who don't adjust, because getting out of it turns out to be its own operation. In a small series of patients who had the upgraded lens swapped back out for a standard one, the halos went away and the distance vision improved. And in every single case, the up-close reading vision they paid for was gone for good, and 10 of the 13 people said they wouldn't repeat the swap even knowing that. So the exit is bad in both directions. Keep the lens and keep the glare, or take it out and use the exact thing you paid for. A different corridor, a different form, a hospital hallway, a family member standing at the nurse's station holding paperwork for a parent or a spouse who stopped being able to swallow safely. The choice on the table is a feeding tube, and the way it's often described to families is as a choice between the tube and letting the person starve. That is not what the doctors who actually study this say. The American Geriatric Society's position is direct. In advanced dementia, a feeding tube is not recommended because careful hand feeding, slow, patient, spoon by spoon, does just as well on survival, on pneumonia risk, on comfort. A large review of the research found no evidence. The tube extends life, improves nutrition markers, or prevents the skin breakdown families are usually told it prevents. Losing the ability to swallow in advanced dementia isn't a nutrition problem waiting to be fixed. It's a stage of the disease itself, the beginning of a dying process already underway, and calling it something a tube can solve is the renaming that gets families into that hallway in the first place. Calories delivered straight to the stomach don't reverse that. Weight loss frequently continues anyway. Meanwhile, the tube adds its own damage on top of it. A confused person pulls at it, so restraints go on, or sedation does. New pressure sores show up from someone spending more time lying still. And the tube doesn't even reliably stop the thing it's usually placed to prevent, which is food or saliva going down the wrong pipe. Families who've been through it describe the same regret over and over, And it's rarely about the tube itself. It's about nobody laying out hand feeding as a real medical option before the form got signed. None of this applies outside advanced dementia. A stroke patient with a swallow expected to come back, someone getting through cancer treatment in the throat. A feeding tube is the right call there, and the same medical societies say so. Same shape, smaller device, longer wait to find out. Somewhere around the waistline or the lower back, a battery pack about the size of a matchbook sits under the skin, wired up the spine to block pain signals before they reach the brain. It goes in after a trial period, wires just taped to the outside for a week or two, and almost everyone whose trial gets recorded says it worked, so going permanent afterward reads as the safe next step. A Cochrane review of the actual permanent devices for back pain found the evidence for lasting benefit, thin, the studies behind it carrying real bias, and put the average US cost at around $30,000 to implant, plus another $10,000 a year in care if something goes wrong. In one manufacturer independent tracking of 400 patients, the device had been surgically taken back out of 17% of people by year 3, 23% by year 5, 38% by year 10. About a third of those removals, specifically, because the pain relief had stopped. The battery pack itself can turn into a lump you feel every time you sit down or roll over in bed, pressing on tissue that was never meant to hold hardware. The wires running up the spine can pull a hard ridge of muscle tight along their path, bad enough on some days that lying flat is the only position that eases it. Getting it out isn't simple either. Scar tissue builds up around the wires over the months and years it's in, and that same scar tissue is what can make a later attempt to reposition the leads impossible. The option closes the longer you wait. There's a detail almost nobody mentions at the consultation. If you ever need an MRI for a stroke, a cancer, a hip, and even one part of your implanted system isn't on the manufacturer's approved list for scanners, the whole system counts as unsafe for that scan, not just the unapproved piece. People in their 60s and 70s are more likely to need an MRI down the road, not less, which runs backwards from what the timing of this decision assumes. The prostate version runs on the same setup, minus the scar tissue. The newer procedures for an enlarged prostate, one uses small permanent implants to hold the tissue open, the other uses steam to shrink part of it, are sold on a specific promise: relief without the sexual side effects of the older operation and without staying on medication every night. Neither one removes tissue. It's held open or partly shrunk, and prostate tissue keeps growing with age regardless, so the blockage tends to come back. A nationwide records analysis published this January tracked what actually happened 5 years out. After the implant procedure, 21% of men were back on one class of medication, 25% on another, 27% on a third. Worse on every one of those numbers than after the older, more invasive operation it was meant to replace. Median age in that data sat right around 70. The operations that actually take tissue out restart medication in the single digits by comparison. The leg version of this same pattern carries the biggest dollar figure, and it's also the one the government has already stepped into. Cramping calf pain that starts when you walk to the mailbox and eases when you stop is the mild end of poor circulation in the legs, and the standard first treatment is walking itself, along with managing blood pressure and cholesterol. The one prescription nobody gets paid to write. Instead, a catheter often goes into the leg artery to shave or laser the plaque out, and each pass injures the vessel wall enough that it tends to narrow again, calling for another pass. A federal inspector general's report this past May found Medicare paid over $1 billion in a single year for these leg procedures, that 3/4 of the more aggressive version were being done in doctors' own offices rather than hospitals, and that $105 million of those office payments carried signs. The work wasn't medically necessary, concentrated among a small number of physicians. The office pays the doctor more per procedure than the same work pays in a hospital, which nobody writes on the consent form as a conflict of interest, though it plainly is one. One interventional radiologist is currently being sued by the Department of Justice over roughly $17 million in leg artery reimbursements collected over 5 years on the government's allegation that a share of the work wasn't needed. His lawyers dispute it, and the case is unresolved, so it stands as an allegation, not a verdict. In fairness to the strongest evidence here, randomized studies on this don't show these procedures costing people their legs. They show the group that gets the procedure needing significantly more repeat procedures, not more amputations. The worst numbers on amputation only turn up in real-world records of older, sicker patients, not in the trials. Worth saying, a 7th procedure got checked for this same pattern before this list was finished, a common foot operation for older adults, and it came back clean. People who had it were less likely to fall in the following years than people who skipped it. Not everything that gets looked at here turns out to be a trap. This list is 6 because 6 is what the evidence actually supported. None of these numbers replace the conversation happening in your own doctor's office, where your labs, your anatomy, and the rest of your health are the only information that actually applies to you. A national study can tell you what happened to thousands of strangers. It can't tell you what will happen to you. The furthest edge of this timeline sits at 15 years out, and it holds the one piece of evidence in this whole list that isn't a records analysis or an observational count, a randomized trial over 1,000 patients tracked for a decade and a half, published in The Lancet. A small aortic aneurysm, a bulge in the body's main blood vessel, gets watched by ultrasound rather than repaired. Because under 5.5 centimeters, the yearly risk of it bursting sits under 1%. The less invasive repair threads a fabric and metal graft into the vessel from the groin instead of opening the abdomen, and for the first several years it looks like the clearly better choice: fewer early deaths, faster recovery. Then something happens that the repair itself creates. The old weakened section of vessel is still there, sitting around the graft rather than removed. Blood can work its way back into that old section around the edges of the graft, slowly repressurizing the very thing that was supposed to be taken out of circulation, leaking the way a bad seal leaks, which is why the medical term for it is an endoleak. Left alone long enough, that leak can make the old section grow again and burst. Years after the repair was called a success. Past the 8-year mark in that Lancet data, the survival lines cross, and beyond that point, total deaths run higher in the group that got the less invasive repair, driven almost entirely by that same old section rupturing later. 13 deaths in that group against 2 in the group that had open surgery instead. In the frailest patients, the ones a doctor is most likely to want to fix before it becomes a problem. A companion trial found the operation itself killed 9% of them within 30 days and did not extend how long the rest of them lived, measured against simply leaving it alone. Under 5.5 centimeters, the yearly rupture risk sits under 1%.